Throughout the course of history, there have always been those specific strange people who have been able to carve out a place for themselves in the most offbeat places. These people come forward to blur the lines between reality, folklore, and legend, staking out a place for themselves within the realm of bizarre historical oddities for which it is nearly impossible to disentangle fact from fiction. One of these has got to be the story of an ordinary man in England who lived a very interesting life and is possibly the oldest person who has ever existed in the history of the world. Our story begins in the 17th century in the small rural hamlet of Winnington, which was located in the parish of Albury in the county of Shropshire in England. At that time, there was a peculiar old man who lived there. Locals referred to him as Thomas Old Tom Parr, and he was primarily known for being an eccentric old man. It was said that he survived solely on sub-rancid cheese and milk in every form, coarse and hard bread and small drink, generally sour whey. Aside from that, he appeared to be an old man who was mostly unremarkable, despite being rather spry for his age. He rarely spoke to anyone, but then one day he became quite talkative, telling the other people in town that he was a lot older than anyone could have ever guessed. According to Parr, who claims to be 152 years old, no one seems to know exactly when or why he began telling his life story all of a sudden, but it is known that he was already quite old. This was a lifespan that was unheard of in those days, and even now in fact, but Parr was perfectly serious when he told his tale. According to him, he had been born close to Wollaston in the year 1483, which was during the second reign of Edward IV, during the final years of the War of the Roses. After that, in the year 1500, he had served in the military after having completed his education. According to his account, he would marry his first wife at the ripe old age of 80 and have 2 children who sadly died in infancy. After the death of his first wife, which occurred when he was 110 years old, he later asserted that he wed his second wife, a widow by the name of Jane Lloyd, when he was 122 years old. According to him, even at such an advanced age, he was still youthful and healthy, and he had made the decision to settle down and live out the rest of his days in Winnington. In an era in which the average lifespan was in the 40s or 50s, the claims of such an old age fascinated the community. As a result, the story spread like wildfire, giving Parr the nickname Old Parr, and turning him into a bit of a celebrity. The tale started to travel beyond the confines of the village and eventually made its way to London, where it was brought to the attention of a man named Thomas Howard, who was the 21st Earl of Arundel. Howard was so captivated by the narrative that he traveled all the way to Shropshire to meet with Parr. Parr managed to persuade Howard that everything described in the narrative was in fact true, and that the elderly man was a genuine, miraculous medical anomaly. In point of fact, Howard was so fascinated by the elderly man, whom he referred to as a curious piece of nature, that he started making plans to bring Parr back to London so that he could meet with King Charles I. When they set out on their journey to London, they were joined by Parr's daughter-in-law, who completely vouched for his story, as well as a man known as Jack the Fool, a sort of entertainer and court jester whose primary responsibility was to keep Parr entertained throughout the duration of the journey. Along the way, they were mobbed by curiosity seekers looking to get a peek at the man who was in his 150s, and these crowds and the excitement only grew bigger the closer they got to London, where the news of Parr had already made him a bit of a sensation and a sort of wonder of the world. In London, he was accorded by the courtesy and respect befitting of a king, and renowned artists Peter Paul Rubens and Anthony van Dyck were commissioned to paint his portrait. Parr was also brought before King Charles I, who questioned him about the accomplishment that he was most proud of during his long life. In response, Parr stated that the fact that he was able to atone for all of his transgressions was his greatest achievement. At the time, there was a lot of speculation about how he had lived for such a long time, and many people credited either his meager and simple diet or the tranquility and fresh air of the countryside where he lived as the reason for his longevity. Despite the fact that Parr enjoyed considerable success in London, he appeared to have suffered as a result of his time spent there. The once very old but spry man started to show signs of deterioration, such as losing his eyesight, having difficulty breathing or walking, and in general giving the impression of aging more quickly than usual. Within a matter of weeks, he started to exhibit the signs of frailty and old age that are consistent with a man who is 152 years old, and then he passed away. When the king had him examined by his personal physician, who also happened to be the doctor who discovered the circulation of the blood, Dr. William Harvey, it was found that his organs were in perfect state, and that he had likely died not of old age, but of pneumonia brought on by London's polluted air, in addition to possibly the stress of city life and new food he was eating. His autopsy report would be titled Anatomical Examination of the Body of Thomas Parr, aged 152 years, despite the fact that Harvey was not entirely convinced that Parr was actually 152 years old. However, he never really officially denied it or argued with it either. The funeral for Old Parr, which took place on November 25, 1635, was organized by King Charles I himself and took place in Westminster Abbey. His gravestone dutifully listed his age as 152, as well as the 10 monarchs whose reigns he had allegedly lived through. At the time, there was no real skepticism about the claims of his incredible age, with people just sort of accepting the story, as fantastic as it sounded. We are left to ponder the degree to which his story is based on actual events. Is it possible that he lied about his age and simply had a very vivid imagination? Or did he really live to be 152 years old? It is unfortunate that there is no real way to truly know because birth records in those days were, at best, spotty and were only kept in the registries of the parishes. Furthermore, there are no concrete records available to prove it either way, so there is no way to know for sure. Charles Bruin was a quiet man who worked as a tailor in Burlington, New Jersey. He had a simple and inconspicuous existence. He had relocated to New Jersey as a Civil War soldier in order to rebuild his life and escape the atrocities of combat. He was a quiet but amiable churchgoer who stayed to himself most of the time and never caused any issue, according to his neighbors. He blended in, was harmless, dull even, and mostly invisible, which was probably how he preferred it. But one day, when he disappeared off the face of the earth, he would become invisible forever. He would later develop into a strange and mysterious mystery involving psychic phenomena, amnesia, and the workings of the human mind. On November 9, 1903, Bruin left his modest house and disappeared without a trace. Nobody ever saw him that day, and he never returned home. He appeared to have vanished into thin air in that moment. Searches were conducted for several weeks, reaching into adjacent states, but the only items recovered were the man's hat and a message with Bruin's name scrawled across it that were found on a boat in New Jersey. None of the ferry crew could recall ever seeing Bruin, which was perhaps not all that strange given how unremarkable and unassuming he was. As the days progressed into weeks and then months, it was believed that Bruin was permanently gone. A conductor by the name of Alfred Woolman witnessed Charles Bruin, who had been gone for a long time, board his trolley in Plainfield, Vermont, 4 years later in 1907. Woolman, who was born in Burlington and knew Bruin, was astounded to see the man for whom everyone had been searching so long and who they had assumed to be dead. Bruin received the unfamiliar blank expression when Woolman went to ask him what had happened and where he had been. He claimed that since his name was Frank Johnson and he was from New York, he must be incorrect. He quickly exited the trolley to hastily continue his journey after claiming he had never heard of Charles Bruin. When Woolman asked around, he learned that Johnson had relocated to Plainfield approximately 3 years earlier and that he was a quiet, reclusive churchgoer, much like Woolman remembered Bruin to be. Woolman was not persuaded despite Johnson's assertion that he was not Bruin and felt something incredibly unusual was occurring. Johnson was once more located by the two after he went to retrieve Bruin's brother. Again, Johnson, who was now clearly irritated by the entire situation, claimed they had made a mistake and displayed no knowledge with Bruin's brother. He even claimed to have a daughter named Anne there for whom he had recently purchased life insurance. He also spoke to them about acquaintances, family, and a former job he had held in New York. Dr. Buchanan, a friend of Frank Johnson, heard about everything from Johnson and thought it was a little strange. However, when he received a call from Johnson's landlady, she informed him that Johnson had woken up in the middle of the night claiming to be Charles Bruin and not knowing where he was. Dr. Buchanan and his father, who had actually known Bruin, went there immediately right away. When they arrived, Johnson appeared confused and sweaty, pallid and drowsy. Since Buchanan had left Burlington the day before to travel to New York, he identified himself as Charles Bruin from Burlington and asked Buchanan why he was in Plainfield the day before. Johnson appeared to have gone back to Bruin, but it also appeared that he had forgotten the previous 4 years of his life. They were unable to recall those 4 years of events, and they were also unable to explain his whereabouts during the 18 months that followed his disappearance before turning up in Plainfield. They assumed he was in New York, but they weren't sure why he had gone there in the first place or what he had done there. Why is it, and did he travel there as Bruin or Johnson since he had not told anyone he was going to New York? Everyone was clueless. Bruin appeared to have all of his memories from his prior life at the time, with the exception of the final 4 years which he had spent as Johnson. The landlady would inform Buchanan that Johnson, now back to Bruin, had experienced a string of prophetic dreams over the previous 3 years, which made the situation even odd. In the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research, the psychiatrist James Hislop, who looked into the case, wrote the following about 2 of these dreams. Bruin regularly spoke of his prophetic dreams, but only the 2 mentioned by Miss Brown and her niece could be remembered with clarity. He shared a dream he had the previous night with Miss Brown the morning of the dying business fire. This was said by him before the fire. It was that she had a fire in the shop and came dangerously close to dying from burns. On a similar day, a fire of that kind did occur, and Mr. Johnson saved Miss Brown from certain death by putting out the flames. Miss Brown showed me the burn scars that the fire left on her arm. Previously, after being repaired, they had sent a fur coat home. The lining was in shambles when it returned, the owner complained. The coat was returned back because Mr. Johnson and Miss Brown were unable to understand it. Then, in his dream, he traveled to New York with the coat, rode an elevator, saw a small man, and was informed by him that the lining skins weren't the appropriate kind. He then promised to carry the coat to New York, which he did the next day. There he saw the man from his dream and relived the dream's events. He was said to have experienced at least 2 other similar prophetic dreams. Intriguingly, Bruin himself had no memory of these dreams, and they disappeared once he returned to being Bruin. This indicated that Johnson, his alter ego whom he had been inhabiting for at least 3 years, was the only psychic among the 2 personalities. Hislop also found no evidence to support Johnson's assertions regarding his friends, family, work, and daughter in New York when he looked into them. He actually found no proof that a Frank Johnson had ever existed. What was happening in this instance? Bruin most likely entered a condition known as a dissociative fugue. It is an uncommon mental health condition characterized by forgetfulness for one's identity, including memories, personality, and other aspects of individuality, and is typically brought on by some kind of traumatic event. The person might operate regularly during the duration of the fugue state, during which time they may take unanticipated vacations or even take on a new identity while remaining unconscious of their previous lives. The fugue state can endure for days, months, or even years. Fugue states are normally reversible, and they frequently terminate abruptly, just as they began. When this happens, the person usually snaps out of them, regaining their past memories but still feeling confused and disoriented. The majority of the time, people will regain their pre-fugue memories but lose any new memories they had acquired during the fugue. It sounds remarkably similar to what had occurred to Bruin. The apparent psychic abilities Bruin displayed while posing as Johnson are a little more difficult to explain. Had Bruin somehow experienced some psychic shock from outside, as Hislop thought that these episodes of forgetfulness might be brought on by outside psychic forces? Why was Bruin endowed with these abilities as Johnson, but lost them when he transformed back into Bruin? Despite the fact that Bruin would assert that he had never had any kind of psychic encounter in his life. It surely introduces intriguing concepts on psychic abilities. Is it feasible for amnesiacs to develop psychic abilities by essentially changing into a different person? How about different personalities? Could it be possible for 2 personalities that share a body to have different psychic abilities? Why is this the case? Is it because just one of the personas is in tune with these powers, as Hislop thought they came from outside forces? The future? Whatever the situation may be, it's a darn weird case and a strange glimpse into the paranormal world of amnesia and psychic phenomena.